Turn your Bibles, please, to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27. This morning I'm simply going to be reading from Matthew's account of the crucifixion of Jesus. And I'm going to make some comments as we go along to help focus our minds on the Lord's Supper. Keep in mind, before we start reading in verse 27, that a lot has already happened to Jesus up to this point. He's already been arrested in Gethsemane, and he was up all night, enduring 3 phases of Jewish trials and 3 phases of the Roman trial that is now going on in the morning. And he's already been beaten up, spat upon, wrongly condemned and accused. And he's also undergoing severe emotional turmoil as his followers, his apostles, have fled. And verse 26 mentions that he's been scourged, which was a beating which in itself would have killed many people. And so he's lost critical amounts of fluid and of blood and is already in unbelievable pain before he's even crucified. Verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and that's the governor's dwelling place, his house, and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. Let's pause here for a moment. I don't know if you've ever had anybody spit in your face. I don't believe I've ever had anybody intentionally just spit in my face. This would be one of the most offensive and disgusting things to ever have happen. If you can imagine somebody spitting in your face. And I don't imagine this was just normal spit, but they would have wanted this to be as disgusting and repulsive as possible. So it would have been the thickest that they could have made it. Right on his face. And placing the crown of thorns on his head because they're mocking him as the king, and he's clothed in purple. And then he has the scepter. They give him the staff. But then they take it from him and they begin beating him on his head. But keep in mind what he has on his head. If you can imagine having a crown of thorns, and if you saw the thorns in that part of the world, they are large. I'm not thinking of briars in your backyard. They are large. And then being beaten over the head while you're wearing that crown. And this is so ironic that all of this is going on, that they're mocking him for claiming to be king of the Jews, even though he told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." It's ironic because Jesus really is the king. He is the King of kings and he is the Lord of lords. It's also ironic because one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Even these criminals. Verse 32, as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. Whoever this Simon was, he didn't want to carry the cross of a crucified victim. Who would have wanted to do that? But little did he know he was carrying the cross of the Lord of heaven. Verse 33, and when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. Now, I've learned and read that this drink which was being offered to him was a dulling agent, and it was an anesthetic. And so it was actually an offer of mercy by Rome to crucified victims. And so when Jesus tasted it and realized what it was, apparently, or maybe just we could say perhaps, the reason he did not drink it is he didn't want the pain to be dulled. Once he realized what was being offered to him, Jesus had every intention to experience the full measure of the pain of the cross. Verse 35, and when they had crucified him, They divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is the King of the Jews." The fact that they were dividing up his garments among them indicates they were taking his clothes from him. He didn't have clothes. In fact, I've read that crucified victims normally were crucified completely naked, adding to the utter humiliation. Verse 38, at that time 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. Now, do you think that was accidental? That Jesus was put right between these 2 criminals? Of course not. It was making a point. Look at the scum of the earth right here. He's just as wicked as these other men. He's right between these 2 criminals, these 2 thieves. Think of how hard that would have been for Jesus to endure. Of all the pain, the physical suffering, think of the fact that Jesus, the only man who never sinned, had to appear before all mankind as just being just as sinful as anybody else, if not the most sinful of anybody, just the scum of the earth. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads. Just picture this. And saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Now just pause here for a second. Remember that in John 2, when Jesus was driving out those money changers from the temple, we call that cleansing the temple, but I wanted to explain it, that he said, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will build it again." And they said it took 46 years to build this temple. But they didn't understand he was talking about the temple of his body. So even here, while they are mocking him, they don't realize what they're saying, because Jesus is going to rebuild the temple of his body in 3 days. He will raise from the dead. And they said, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Now, Jesus didn't come down from the cross, but could he have? Absolutely. Jesus was allowing all of this to happen. Jesus had said, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." He was allowing His own creation to crucify Him. He could have called 12 legions of angels, as He Himself said in Matthew 26, or as the song we sing, He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set Him free, but He died alone for you and me. He could have done that. But He was going to do something far greater. He wasn't merely going to come down from the cross. He was going to raise Himself from the dead on the 3rd day. And would they believe in Him then? No. Verse 41, in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking Him and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save Himself. He is the King of Israel. Let Him now come down from the cross and we will believe in Him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if He delights in him. For He Himself said, 'I am the Son of God.'" The robbers who had been crucified with Him were also insulting Him with the same words. Again, the appearance that Jesus being crucified would take to everybody watching was, God hates that person. That's the appearance. And this would have been so hard for Jesus to have to endure, that kind of scoffing. I want us to turn, and hold your place here, but turn to Psalm 22, the 22nd Psalm. This is a messianic psalm that David wrote. And it applies to David first, but ultimately to Jesus. David was suffering, and David was being scoffed at by his enemies. And look in verses 7 and 8 of Psalm 22. David said, "All who see me sneer at me. They separate with the lip. They wag the head, saying, 'Commit yourself to the Lord. Let Him deliver him. Let Him rescue him, because He delights in him.'" Do you realize that that is a quotation? That, in other words, is a prophecy of the very words that the enemies of Jesus were using in Matthew 27. They were fulfilling prophecy. They had no idea that they were doing that. But that had been prophesied over 1,000 years before the very words that they would utter. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea they were fulfilling prophecy. 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 8 says that the rulers of this world did not understand the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God. If they had understood that wisdom, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They had no idea they were fulfilling prophecy. They had no idea that by putting Jesus to death on the cross, that they were fulfilling the very plan of God that He had had before the world even began. They had no idea that by their crucifying Jesus, they were crowning Him as King. They weren't stopping Jesus. They weren't ending Jesus. This was just the beginning. They had no idea what they were doing. And in verse 45, it says, "Now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour." Now the 6th hour would be about noon, if you start counting when the sun comes up. And so from noon until about 3 o'clock, the 9th hour. Now, that would be the hottest part of the day, normally. That would be the brightest part of the day. But that's the part of the day that God chose to make dark. To make a point. Hey, it's supposed to be really bright out right now, and it's really dark. There was darkness upon all the land. Some commentators suggest that means upon all the earth. I'm not sure about that, but it certainly indicates a large area. And I'm not sure what this darkness would have been exactly like. Clouds, storm, that we know we have an earthquake happening here soon, but it was eerie. There's even writings of, in this very year, that some thought that there was an eclipse. Well, there wasn't an eclipse. We know that at this time there wasn't an eclipse, but it might have appeared to people to be something like that. Verse 46 about and by the way, God was trying to get everybody's attention here as to what is going on here. Verse 46, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. So keep in mind, this is about the 9th hour. This is about 3 o'clock. This is about the time He died, right before He died. I mean, this is maybe minutes before He's actually going to die. Maybe shorter than that. Very shortly before He's actually going to die. And He cries out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." And that is Aramaic. It's kind of like Hebrew. It's very similar to Hebrew. It would have been Jesus' common language. And what He was saying in English is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, Matthew, just 3 verses earlier, alluded back to the 22nd Psalm. And here, Jesus is quoting the first verse of that psalm. I've preached about this before, but some of you have not heard that sermon. I want us to turn back to Psalm 22 again for a second. And you'll notice that verse 1 is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" David felt forsaken. But he wasn't actually forsaken, because look at verse 24. "For He," that is God, "has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has He hidden His face from him. But when he cried to Him for help, He heard." This psalm is not a psalm of despair. It is not a psalm of defeat. It starts that way. David feels forsaken, but David realizes he was never forsaken. His God was there for him the whole time. His God delivered him, and the psalm ends up being this beautiful psalm of praise to God for His deliverance. This entire psalm applies to Jesus. And by quoting the first verse, I believe what Jesus was doing, He was teaching from the cross. He was saying out loud for everybody to hear, I am the fulfillment of the 22nd Psalm. Think of what that might have later meant to the priests and the scribes who went and read it and saw that the very words that they said were prophesied in that psalm. Well, coming back to Matthew 27, verse 47, and some of those who were standing there when they heard it began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah." That was probably Greek-speaking people that thought that because they didn't understand when he said Eli, or Eloi, as Mark records it in the Aramaic, that he was saying God. They thought he was calling for Elijah when they heard Eli. Immediately one of them ran, taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. Now this would have been like the common drink of the day, like vinegar mixed with water. And Jesus needed something to drink, so he did. Verse 49, but the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. We know from Luke's account that what he said here was, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And behold, and let's just picture this, just imagine this. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. There's great symbolism there I can't get into. And the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened. Now picture this. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, in other words, they had died, were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. What a transformation. That those very men that had clothed Jesus in scarlet, probably the very men that had scourged him and clothed him in scarlet and placed that crown of thorns on his head and spat on his face and violently hammered large spikes through his hands and through his feet and mocked at him and jeered at him, were now saying, truly, this was the Son of God. And we were those men. Because we are the ones who mocked at him and spat in his face and who nailed him to that cross. But now we've become convinced. When you look at the account and you read about Jesus' death and you understand about God's plan before the foundation of the world and you read about Jesus' resurrection, we are all convinced through the eyes of faith to believe, truly, this is the Son of God. And we're sorry for what we did to him because we've hurt him so badly. But he loved us so much that he died for us. This morning, as we take the Lord's Supper, let us remember all of these things. Let us remember the things that happened to Jesus. And let us confirm to God our belief that truly this is the Son of God.